Have you ever been judged before even saying a word? Have you ever found yourself facing assumptions based solely on how you look or where you're from? It happens more often than you might think, but what if, just for once, you found out that the person you're judging is someone who could change the course of your life in an unexpected way? Before we dive in, I want you to get involved. Comment below with your name and the city you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join the community that's making an impact, one story at a time. Marcus Jones' heart pounded in his chest as he walked up to his new home at 1840 to Oak Lane, his hands gripping the last of the moving boxes. It had been a long journey to get here, one filled with moments of doubt, hope, and perseverance. He couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he stood before his new colonial-style house, neatly nestled in a quiet, well-maintained neighborhood. As he carried box after box into his new home, Marcus noticed the subtle but unmistakable stares from behind drawn curtains. The faces that lingered for just a moment, peeking through the windows, seemed to study him as though he were an anomaly. It wasn't the first time he had experienced such scrutiny. Living in a predominantly white neighborhood meant that he often felt like an outsider, despite his accomplishments. Marcus was keenly aware that his race, one that made him stand out in a place where black residents made up less than 5% of the population, was going to bring about challenges, but he was determined not to let it stop him. The crisp autumn air was cool against his skin, and the quiet neighborhood seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but the subtle tension was palpable. Despite the warmth he felt from the achievement of owning a home, there was a constant, nagging awareness that he was likely one of the very few people of color here, and that would never go unnoticed. Marcus worked methodically, unloading boxes, focusing on his task. He told himself that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. As he worked, his eyes flicked to the windows again. There was movement in one of the houses across the street, and he saw an older woman peek her head around a corner, watch for a brief moment, and then retreat behind her curtains. A sigh escaped Marcus's lips as he continued his task, silently reminding himself to ignore the looks and to keep his composure. Around mid-afternoon, as Marcus was unloading his final few boxes, a door across the street creaked open, and the older woman stepped outside. She was hesitant at first but gave him a small, tentative wave, which he returned with a friendly, welcoming gesture. Her smile was brief and uncertain, and after a moment of silence, she quickly retreated back into her home. Despite the lack of verbal engagement, Marcus took this as a sign to keep going. However, as he went about his work, he noticed a growing sense of activity in the neighborhood. Conversations drifted across lawns in hushed tones, and windows on every house seemed to flicker with motion as people peered out, watching him. Marcus reminded himself again to stay focused and that this would pass. Tomorrow would bring the moving truck, the real start of his new life, but what Marcus didn't realize was that his arrival had sent ripples through the community. Next door, Tom Wilson, the middle-aged man who lived in the house beside Marcus, stood in his living room, his face edged with anxiety as he peered through the blinds, watching Marcus carefully. Tom's mind raced, and the tension in his body spoke volumes about his discomfort. Marcus's presence in his mind was disrupting the quiet rhythm of Oak Lane, and he was determined to do something about it. As the evening grew darker, Tom's sense of unease reached its peak. The quiet, suburban street had been disturbed by Marcus's arrival, and now Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He reached for his phone, dialing 911 in a panic. His voice was tight, full of uncertainty, but with an edge of anxiety that he couldn't control. "There's a suspicious man in my neighbor's house," he blurted out, his words tumbling out faster than he could think. "I think he might be breaking in. He's been carrying boxes inside all afternoon." The operator's voice was calm, professional, but Marcus could hear the slight undercurrent of skepticism. "Can you describe the person, sir? What exactly makes you think he's suspicious?" Tom hesitated. The logic of his own claim was beginning to crumble under the weight of his biases. "Well, he's not from around here," Tom stammered, his voice wavering. "He doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood." The operator pressed further. "Sir, can you be more specific?" What is he wearing? What actions have you observed that seem suspicious? Tom's frustration began to mount. His vague, instinctual fears had no real foundation. Look, I know what I'm seeing. This is a safe, quiet neighborhood. We don't get many new people moving in, especially not. Well, not someone like him. The operator's voice softened, but remained firm. Sir, I understand you're concerned, but we need concrete reasons to dispatch officers. Has this person done anything illegal or threatening? Tom's eyes stayed fixed on Marcus, who was carrying another box into his house. No, I guess not. But shouldn't someone at least verify if he's supposed to be here? There was a long pause on the line before the operator responded, her tone acknowledging the unspoken truths behind Tom's call. Sir, moving into a new home is not a crime. Without evidence of wrongdoing, we can't question someone's right to be in their own neighborhood based on how they look. Despite the operator's efforts to reason with him, Tom's fears remained unchanged. Please, just send someone, for the safety of the community. Reluctantly, the operator agreed to dispatch a unit. As Tom hung up, he felt a mixture of relief and unease settle over him. His mind spun as he peered out the window, watching the flashing lights of the police cruiser approach Marcus's house. Marcus, now aware of the attention, took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to unfold. Stepping out onto his porch, Marcus felt the weight of the situation settle over him. He could already feel the sting of being misunderstood, but as the officers approached, he straightened his back, ready to stand his ground. The taller officer spoke first, his voice even but laced with tension. Good evening, sir. We received a call about suspicious activity. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Marcus's gaze was steady as he replied calmly, Of course, officers. How can I help you? The shorter officer gave him a scrutinizing look. Can you tell us what you're doing here? Marcus's patience was thinning, but he remained composed. I live here, he said, his voice firm. I just moved in today. Before the officers could respond, Tom Wilson suddenly burst out of his house, his face flushed with anxiety. That's him, officers, he shouted, pointing at Marcus. He doesn't belong here. Marcus's frustration simmered, but he managed to keep his voice steady as he addressed Tom directly. Sir, I understand your concern, but I assure you, I do live here. I'm your new neighbor, Tom scoffed. Prove it. Then, the officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance, unsure of how to proceed. Marcus, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment, reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out his ID. I'd be happy to, he said, his voice calm but resolute. As the taller officer read Marcus's ID, his eyes widened in disbelief. You're Chief Jones, he stammered, staring at the card in his hand. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's right, I'm the new police chief for this district. I start next week, but I wanted to get settled in first. The shock in the officers' faces was immediate and telling. The situation had shifted in an instant. The power dynamics had altered, and now, the officers stood with their postures straightened, their eyes wide with the realization of what had just unfolded. Tom Wilson's face drained of color as the implications sank in. I'm so sorry, Chief. The shorter officer stammered. Clearly embarrassed, Marcus raised a hand, his expression softening. It's all right, officers, you were just doing your job, but I hope this serves as a reminder about the dangers of making assumptions. In that moment, as the initial tension dissolved, Marcus saw the first glimmers of change in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as the neighbors, who had gathered to witness the commotion, dispersed, Marcus knew that his work in this community was only beginning. The stunned silence that followed was thick with unspoken realizations. Some of the gathered neighbors couldn't meet his gaze, while others, like Tom Wilson, seemed to be grappling with their own biases. Marcus seized the moment, stepping forward to address the group. I understand this isn't the introduction any of us expected, Marcus began, his voice steady and calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. I've had my own experiences with racial profiling, and I've learned that what's often assumed about a person can be far from the truth. As Marcus spoke, something shifted. The energy in the crowd changed from suspicion to reflection, from tension to curiosity. Marcus, aware of the power of the moment, continued, I'm here to create a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued, he said, his words resonating with a quiet authority. And part of that is engaging in difficult conversations. We must understand one another better, and that starts with acknowledging our biases. Some nodded in agreement, their faces softening. Others, still unsure, shifted uncomfortably. Change was never easy, but Marcus knew it was necessary. It starts with each one of us, he concluded, his voice full of resolve. The silence that followed was charged with potential. Then, turning toward Tom, Marcus extended his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I'd like you to be part of the solution. Your perspective is valuable in creating a safer, more inclusive neighborhood for everyone." There was a long pause before Tom, visibly torn, stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand. The brief but firm handshake felt like a small victory, one step toward understanding, one step toward healing. Marcus stood on his porch long after the crowd had dispersed, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. He knew that the true work was just beginning. The incident with Tom Wilson had sparked something in the community, but there was still much to be done. In the coming weeks and months, Marcus would work tirelessly to bring change to Oak Lane. The appointment as police chief had already started conversations that many had long avoided. Officers struggled with their own biases, but some embraced the change, attending training and engaging in community outreach. Tom Wilson, who had initially resisted the shift, slowly came around, joining a community advisory board and contributing to the conversations about how to move forward. As Marcus sat on his porch one evening, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of cautious optimism. There were still hurdles to overcome, but the first steps had been taken. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. He would lead by example, determined to build a community where empathy, justice, and understanding were the foundation of every interaction. Join our community of people who believe in justice, empathy, and powerful storytelling. By subscribing, you're not just watching, you're part of a movement that values real stories and real change.